Thank you for joining us today. I'm Susan Stecker and I am the Vendor Director for ITR Cyber. We're actually one of only 2 UK resellers for Risk Exchange, and the reason we chose to work with Risk Exchange, we're very impressed with the way they automate, the fast onboarding and their continued risk monitoring, as well as their cost effectiveness in this vertical. So today we are joined by Darren Craig. He is the founder and CEO of Risk Exchange. He has over 30 years experience in cybersecurity, including senior roles at NatWest Banking Group, IBM Security, before founding Risk Exchange in 2017. Risk Exchange now delivers continuous third-party monitoring across financial services, transport, and critical infrastructure. It has been a Security Solution of the Year winner at the European IT and Software Excellence Awards, and it's also been recognised as a cool vendor by Gartner. Darren, amongst other things, also serves as an independent cybersecurity expert to the European Commission. And now, to move forward, I'm going to hand over to Darren.
Thanks, Susan. Hello, everybody. Good afternoon. I think most people are probably on this call are from the UK, so good afternoon. So very happy to deliver this webinar for everyone to hopefully provide some thought leadership and some education around this particular subject. This particular subject is a very topical thing at the moment because of the increase in the number of supply chain attacks, which is currently it's up around 68% on the previous year. So it's a pretty big problem. Today, what we're going to do is we're going to spend about 30 to 45 minutes looking or talking about third-party risk and some of the problems with maybe the current program or the current approaches, and some of our suggested approaches that you can put in place to improve the program itself. You'll be glad to hear that it's not a product walkthrough, so I'm not going to bombard you with features, functions, show you demos, anything like that. It is a genuine, education piece to talk about the problem as it is today, and genuine ways that you can solve some of those problems, and hopefully reach out to us afterwards to help address some of these problems as well. Some of the things we'll be talking about are obviously the number of attacks, but also the increase in regulation around NIS2, or NIST in the UK, DORA, of course, around financial services, etc., and FCA regulations, PRA regulations in the UK. So anyway, so we'll cover these as we go through. Feel free to drop in any questions into the chat, and we will answer those at the end. We'll have a live Q&A at the end of the session. So today, as I said, we're going to cover the threat landscape. We're going to talk about what the regulators expect these days compared to maybe what they would have expected 3 or 4 years ago. I think things have changed a lot in terms of regulation around third-party risk. We'll talk about the visibility gap, and the same old saying that you can't measure what you can't see effectively, or you can't secure what you can't see. So that's a key thing. And then we'll talk about a sort of practical path, how you can solve some of the problems that you may be facing today, or maybe you're starting out to build your own program, or you've got an existing program and you're looking for ways to improve that. And as I said, we'll follow up with a live Q&A at the end. So yeah, it's a big number, 68%, and 68% of attacks do originate now from the supply chain. I'm sure you hear it every single day on the news. It's very common nowadays. I think the days of companies being breached via their what's traditionally called their enterprise, their sort of perimeter, their internal information, is long gone at this stage. The attackers have decided that that's too hard for them, so they have decided to focus in on attacking companies from their supply chain, because of course this is where the weakest link is. There's a lot of SaaS products in there, so of course a lot of small companies providing different services. And unfortunately, a lot of these companies, smaller companies, just don't have the resources maybe to secure their systems and what have you. And that's definitely where we can help. So if we look at the typical programs today, and it is still very much 2020. I've been working in security now for over 27 years now, and I've seen a lot of different companies, from very, very large companies, very large banks, HSBC Bank, for example, to some very small companies. And I've seen all sorts of different approaches to third-party risk. But unfortunately, most of the programs out there today are still using annual questionnaires, still using spreadsheets, and they may or may not review those particular companies every 12 months. It's quite shocking to see that some companies only get reviewed when they come on board initially into the company, but they never get looked at again. This really comes down to a resourcing problem. It's not that the business doesn't have the will or the want or the requirement to review these companies every year, or maybe more often, but they just don't have the bandwidth, they don't have the resource, etc., to deliver that. And again, that's where we'll touch on some of the ways to help address that. So one of the big articles that you may have heard of, or regulations you may have heard of, NIS2, it's already required within Europe for a lot of companies. Any company that's in the UK, critical national infrastructure, for example, will be required to be NIS2 compliant. But there is an existing NIS regulation in place which companies do have to comply with. But it doesn't really, it doesn't have a lot of strict requirements around third-party risk. But NIS2 has a particular article, Article 21, and it goes into a lot of requirements, very deep requirements around supply chain risk. So if you are required to be compliant with NIS2, then you certainly will expect your suppliers to be compliant with Article 21. And even if you're mainly doing business within the UK, but you do have some customers or IT supplier services from outside the UK into Europe, then you will be required to be compliant with this. And it requires things like, obviously supply chain security, assessing the suppliers, assessing the service providers, the IT service providers. A lot of large IT service providers now across the world are all required to be compliant with this particular article, NIS2. And this is because they're obviously doing business in Europe. It's very hard to, distinguish, where does your data go? How is that transaction occurring? In a lot of cases, it doesn't just get, contained within the UK. Unfortunately, it does spread out across the globe or across Europe. Article 21 requires you as an organization to have a continuous risk management program in place. So this goes way, way beyond, sending out a spreadsheet once a year to a particular company, or worse still, maybe every 2 to 3 years. There is a requirement to have continuous monitoring. And continuous monitoring effectively means not just continuously sending out spreadsheets, of course, or some form of questionnaire or assessment. It also requires external cybersecurity continuous monitoring, because you want to know, of course, has that particular supplier had a data breach? Have they got a new security vulnerability? Things like that. Of course, you want to know about that, because that's putting your organization at risk. You will be required to have an incident handling and reporting program in place. And hopefully everyone on the call has this already for their own organization. It's a fundamental part of any risk management cybersecurity program. But you are now required to include your third parties within this particular incident handling reporting. So if your third party has an incident or some sort of breach, they need to report that to you, also to report it to the regulators. But you also then in turn need to report it to your regulators also as well. So it's very important you have a process in place to detect whenever a third party does suffer some form of breach. And unfortunately, in a lot of cases, third parties suffer breaches, but they just don't disclose it as quick as they should do. So it's important to have an independent method there to check on these things, and then you're able to confidently say, we have picked up this third party, we've seen they've had a breach or a ransomware attack or something like that. And of course, then you need to respond to these events as they happen and report to the regulator. NIS2 is quite scary in some ways, just because it does hold the directors or the management of the company responsible as well for these requirements. You know, long gone are the days whenever cybersecurity was just something that happened in the IT department. Effectively, it didn't really affect the rest of the business. It was really, you know, it was something that was there. It was a cost center, really. But now it's extremely important that the management team and the board are full visibility of third-party risk, because they could be held personally responsible for any loss of data or any data breach within the supply chain, or the data that they're passing down into the supply chain. For example, HR data or any form of confidential data, things like that. So moving on to one of the other regulations, DORA, specifically Article 28. So it does require you to maintain a register of all of your third parties. And this just doesn't mean a register of the critical ones. And what does that even mean? You know, what is critical, what's not critical? That's a whole different discussion. But it's important that you maintain a full and detailed register of all of your suppliers right across the organization. Unfortunately, I see too many cases where I walk into a business and I say, how many suppliers do you actually have? And they struggle to answer it. They just don't know. And part of the reason for that is because they only know about the suppliers within their own domain, their own space. So if I ask this to the IT director, for example, he will say, oh, we've got 20 suppliers within the IT department, but that's not enough for DORA. You need to understand all of the suppliers across the organization. And really the only way to do that is to carry out a comprehensive audit across the organization to identify who those partners are and go on to risk assess them. You are legally required under DORA to carry out pre-contract due diligence. So you have to assess the providers. You have to assess their supply chains as well. You know, who are they using to provide services, etc. You also need to have an exit strategy, which is a new thing. This didn't really exist until DORA came about. So as well as, you know, the challenges of onboarding a new vendor and getting them through the assessment, you also now need to think about what happens if we have to stop working with that particular supplier. What happens if that supplier has a data breach? How do we move forward? Do we try and find another supplier? How do we offboard that supplier? What records do we need to keep, et cetera, et cetera? So this creates a lot of, administration, a lot of paperwork, et cetera, a lot of information you have to store and keep for 7 years. It's not something you can just throw away. Of course, DORA does require, like our NIST does require ongoing monitoring. So you are required to continuously monitor the performance of and the security of that particular critical supplier. What I mean by ongoing monitoring, I mean like attack surface, external cybersecurity type information like breach detection, things like that. And of course, as I've just sort of touched on, documented exit and resilience plans. Now, one of the big challenges with DORA is it's moved on from you need to assess your third parties. It's also now asking you need to assess who their third parties are, who are your fourth and nth parties. And this is a really difficult thing to do, because where do you even start with this? You can go to your third party and you can ask them, you know, tell me who your third parties are, provide critical services. They can provide that today, but that's probably out of date, right? So maybe that'll change next week. They don't inform me around this. GDPR has a similar type requirement, but again, it's very difficult to maintain this. And it's a lot of companies initially, when they started to look at this, they try to document this and maintain this registrar, if you like, across their fourth and nth parties in a spreadsheet. And they quickly found that this just does not work. you need some form of continuous process that checks this in real time, and ideally at some sort of independent source that checks this information and sort of validates what the third party is telling you, because you will be held responsible for collecting that information, assessing those suppliers as well, and making sure you can evidence that if you're required to during your annual audits. Now, the two regulations I've just covered, of course, are very much focused on Europe, and I guess one of the benefits of Brexit is that you no longer have to comply with certain regulations within Europe. But sort of what it looks like now is the UK is very quickly moving to align with these regulations, and they already have some requirements, and they have had some for a while. They've had the UK NIST regulations since 2018, which is very similar to the NIST 2, but it doesn't have as much third-party requirements in there. You have the PRA regulation, of course. A lot of insurance companies need to be compliant with this. And it looks at operational resilience as well. So it's very important for any insurance organization within the UK to be fully compliant with this operational resilience. And this is really saying that you need to understand who are your suppliers providing critical services? Is that a resilient supplier? Is there any risk concentration issues within that supply chain, etc.? So it goes into quite a lot of detail, and it creates a lot of work for the teams that have to try and collect that information and maintain it. And of course, the FCA, Financial Services, you are required to have operational resilience, PS 21/3 in place. So these two together, the PRA, the FCA operational resilience, and the NIST, and the upcoming update to that, we expect an update to that pretty soon. So it'll fully align with NIST 2 going forward. These three together cause a lot of workload for teams to make sure that they're compliant. But of course, if you're not compliant, then the business is not legal. It's a legal requirement to have these things in place. Now, you might say, well, what if we don't do anything about this, right? So we'll just take our chances. This happened a lot with GDPR. A lot of companies didn't implement anything at all. And unfortunately, some companies have been heavily fined since it. But these regulations are they have a lot of teeth to them. So, you could be exposed to a fine of up to 2% of your global turnover under NIST. You could have your license revoked under DORA. So if you're found in breach of DORA, then your financial license anywhere in Europe could be revoked, and that would obviously have a big impact on the business itself. And also, as I mentioned already, the management and the directors of the company, the shareholders, maybe not shareholders, directors are responsible for making sure these things are in place, because they are personally liable and you have to be accountable to the regulator. So it's not really an option not to have these regulations in place. And hopefully anyone on this call, any organization this call, is not in a position where they do not have these regulations. But I would encourage you to look a bit deeper into the organizations and understand what it means when it comes to third-party risk. Now, so one of the core problems here is the visibility cap. If you're sending out a spreadsheet to a company, maybe once a year, maybe once every couple of years, and you might be surprised to see that you're getting all greens coming back, right? So they're coming back, oh, they have this and have this in place, and that's all good. And you might be shocked to hear that a lot of companies, when they send out these spreadsheets, they can't get providers to supply the information, right? That's one of the big challenges they have today. But when they do supply the information is generally, it's a good picture, right? Of course, it's been responded to in a positive way, but it's never been validated. There's no validation of that information whatsoever. There's no audit being carried out. It's really just what we call in the business as an SAQ. So it's really very, very weak when it comes to validation and true audit against a particular business. But one of the big things this misses is the fact that the company could have suffered a breach in between those 12-month reviews. You could have carried out a review today and tomorrow they had a breach, for example, or you could have carried out a review today and 3 weeks later they have a new security vulnerability which has opened them up to some form of ransomware attack. And these issues that tend to come up, critical vulnerabilities, etc. These issues expose companies to ransomware attacks or cyber attacks, and obviously then indirectly expose your data potentially and your organization if you have some form of, digital connection to that company. And when I say digital connection, I can mean something as simple as an email, right? We've seen many companies, third parties compromised, and then they've used the email system to spread that particular attack out to their customers. That's not uncommon at all. So it is important to have this particular part of the picture covered. It's important to have continuous monitoring in place. Otherwise, you just don't have visibility. And unfortunately, most of the attacks today come through this live attack surface or digital footprint, as some people might call it. So it's very, very important to cover not only the inside of the organization in terms of, do they have a good program, maybe collect some evidence around that. That would definitely help. And you probably find once you ask for evidence, then you probably find that the greens start to turn into reds, right? They're not so good once they have to prove that they have that in place. But it's extremely important to have the outside of the organization, what we typically call outside in, covered, because this is where most of the problems occur. So now continuous monitoring. So that's the sort of next piece really then when it comes to this, and we've touched on this a little bit. So what does continuous monitoring mean? So it really starts. It's really got 4 key steps. Each one of these goes into a lot of detail, which I'm not going to go into today. But we're more than happy to have a one-to-one conversation around your particular organization and go into these in a lot more detail. But at a high level, there's 4 steps. So step 1 is where you have to discover the suppliers that you have in your organization. And discovery can mean a number of different things. It can mean looking across the purchase ledger of the organization, talking to different parts of the organization, different teams within the organization, running some sort of scanning software to identify who those organizations are that are providing services. So that's a pretty comprehensive piece of work at the beginning of any third-party program, but it's a critical piece of that, because if you can't identify the suppliers that you're working with, then there's really no chance to put in place good security controls around them, and there's absolutely no way to report back to the regulator on these suppliers. And if one of these suppliers that you haven't discovered has an issue, then of course you're not going to have any information on them. So the discovery piece is critical to any third-party management program. And that discovery should be, it should be repeated on a continuous basis. Things change all the time. And that discovery should also include your fourth parties, right? So the companies that provide services to your third parties themselves. Then once you've got the discovery in place and you've got that ongoing process running, then the next piece is to monitor that, monitor for security breaches, monitor for new security vulnerabilities, monitor for changes in their security posture in some way. Maybe they did a security assessment today and something changed within their program. If they don't have the ability to let you know that through some form of continuous assessment process, then you're not going to know about it, right? That change has happened. So the picture you're actually working with is completely out of date. So it's important to have a monitoring process in place. And of course, you're never going to do this with a person. This does require some form of automation and tooling to monitor these organizations that you have discovered and have raised any alerts that you need to be made aware of, like a security breach or a data breach. Of course, you want to know about that as soon as possible. Then once you are monitoring these organizations, you're going to get a lot of information, right, coming back. And not all of the information is critical, of course, right? A lot of it is maybe it's important, but it's not important when it comes to some of your critical suppliers. So it's important to prioritize the information that's coming back. And one way to prioritize this is to only look for security information or risk information that is aligned to your critical suppliers, or what we call in the business tier 1 suppliers. Because typically when you go through the discovery process and bring these suppliers into your program, you want to tier them, right? So you want to assign some form of inherent risk level to them, whether that's tier 1, tier 2, or tier 3. And then when it comes to prioritization of the information you're picking up during your monitoring process, then you can say, well, that information only relates to a tier 3 supplier. They provide coffee to us, or they provide a water cooler service. They're not so important. You mightn't be even monitoring them in the first place. But if it applies to a very large, IT supplier, that the email supplier, for example, or provides your web services, your IT services if they're outsourced, then of course you want to prioritize that information and act on it as soon as possible. And then the fourth stage is really to try and remediate that, right? Work with the partner to remediate those issues. And it's important that you have a strong relationship with that supplier, so you do have that open communication, strong collaboration between you and the supplier, so you can reach out to them and say, hey, we've picked up this particular issue. Can you tell us what you're doing about it? In this way, you will get a quick response to that inquiry, right? If you don't have a strong relationship with that particular company, or they're not aware that you're monitoring them in some way, then it's going to be difficult, right? They're just going to, they're not going to respond as quickly as they should be, maybe to something like that. So it's important to have that strong relationship so you can go through remediation. Now, there's one step on this which I've sort of touched on, but I'm not going to go into too much detail. And that's really where, what happens if a supplier is breached? Do you need to find another supplier, for example? So you're not going to remediate, right, with them. Unfortunately, you're going to have to discontinue that relationship and look for another supplier. So this is also something that you need to think about during your program design, in terms of what is the criticality of these particular suppliers. And that feeds into your tiering. If a supplier is the only supplier of a particular service anywhere in the world, of course, they're critical, right? But if they're providing a service there's hundreds or thousands of these suppliers, it's going to be very easy to find a new supplier. So that they may be a tier 2 in that case, etc. So there's a number of different ways to look at this tiering. And we work with customers every single day to define what these tiers look like and implement them within the business themselves. Now, some of the capabilities of a modern program, that's how you're looking to move forward in this and build out your program, is obviously you need this live supplier inventory, the discovery piece. You need to be aware of any new suppliers that are coming on board. You can't just rely on getting a quick email from your supply chain to let you know that they have got a new supplier. It's extremely important, I've already said, it's extremely important to provide continuous monitoring of the security posture, the external security posture of your third parties. And this should include all of your third parties, okay? It's really, really important, because what we find that some small organizations that are not being checked suffer some form of breach because they have the weakest security. But unfortunately, if you're communicating with them, through email can spread a particular threat, or someone could raise an invoice to your organization, for example, from them for payment, or raise a payment request. It'll look like it's coming from their email address, of course, so you would trust it. But again, these types of attacks happen within all sorts of organizations. So it's important to monitor all companies for data breaches. Threat intelligence is important, where you look at leak credentials, dark web information, and this is a key requirement in the regulations. Again, it's a recently, a newly introduced requirement when it came to DORA. There was never really any mention of threat intelligence, but now it's a key requirement. And again, that does require, working with a supplier to provide that intelligence, and then align that with your supplier's information. Concentration risk in fourth party is key now. It's required from a regulatory point of view, but again, the realities of third party risk is fourth parties do get compromised. These attacks can, run all the way up to you, up to the third party, and then up to yourself. So again, it's important to have visibility of those. And one of the other challenges with third party risk is concentration risk. So if you have a whole bunch of suppliers, let's say you've got a few hundred suppliers, how do you know that all of those suppliers aren't using one IT provider? So that straight away, that creates concentration risk within your organization. How do you know that all of those suppliers are not, suffering from a particular nasty security vulnerability, or 50% of them are suffering from a security vulnerability? You have no way of knowing that without putting in place some form of monitoring and assessing them for concentration risk. And of course, workflow, evidence collection processes are, they're the sort of, some people see them as the boring piece of the program, but they're extremely important, right? That you do have a solid workflow that starts, in most cases, starts with the procurement team all the way through the supply chain effectively, or internally, supplier stakeholders, procurement, security, data protection, compliance, legal, etc. All of those stakeholders need to be involved in third-party risk. And there needs to be a joined up workflow that covers all of those stakeholders. There needs to be a single sort of view of that supplier across all of those stakeholders. The days are gone that, procurement had one particular set of tools or the information they were working with the supplier, but security was also assessing the same supplier, but they had their different requirements. So there was all of these silos, and there still is in a lot of companies, to be honest, that I talk to. All of these silos have been developed, and there's no information sharing among these key stakeholders. So this is something that really needs to change, and that can only change through, it sort of starts off with the processes and the workflows and evidence sharing across the stakeholders. And then, of course, regulatory reporting is key. You need to annually report on these regulations. Of course, if you're a company that's going through regular annual audits, you can guarantee that the auditors will also be looking at this, and you may have had some conversations with auditors already around some of this. So it is a key part. It's not something that's sort of done once and never talked about again. You are required to report on it going forward. And you are required to report on any new breaches, the level of information you collect, et cetera, et cetera. So it gets into quite a lot of detail. Now, this was a tier one financial services company. And I'm not going to disclose who it was, but they had 1,247 third-party suppliers. And once they put in place a solid program like the one we just covered, they were able to get this full visibility across all of these suppliers. And they built a platform, they built Risk Exchange around this program. And this sort of ended up with a 92% savings reduction in manual effort. Because what they were doing previously was they had spreadsheets. Effectively, they had a single spreadsheet. Well, I maybe had a few spreadsheets, one for cybersecurity, one for data protection, maybe one for ESG, etc. And different people within the organization were sending out these spreadsheets to the same suppliers, the same common suppliers. Maybe one day got a security questionnaire. The next week they got a procurement questionnaire or a data protection questionnaire, etc. So there was no joined up approach, and there was a lot of manual process. So what this company did was they implemented Risk Exchange. Risk Exchange, was able to discover all of these suppliers with them and their help across the organization. We were able to put in a continuous monitoring program. And of course, straight away, they got results from that. They could see straight away they were able to risk score those companies very, very quickly, all 1,200 of them. And the process that they were using to assess these companies, the spreadsheet, manually sending out, chasing them, multiple spreadsheets from different stakeholders was all put into Risk Exchange, and this helped them to automate that process completely. So Risk Exchange took that process and completely automated it end to end, and it meant that they didn't have to manually chase or send out spreadsheets, build questionnaires, anything like that. And they took 90 days to demonstrate compliance. It's very quick to implement a platform like Risk Exchange. And within 90 days, they were able to produce the evidence that they really couldn't do without spending months and months and months going through lots of spreadsheets, building, various pieces of information from different systems. And they were able to go to one system and then generate a report which showed the regulator they're in full compliance with Article 21 of NIS 2. And of course, they're no longer now at risk. They could have been at risk of up to 3.6 billion euros of regulatory exposure if they had suffered some form of breach. So 90-day path is typically, it starts off with discovery and baselining. That's where we would help you come in and discover those third parties, baseline what is their inherent risk today, what is their tier, etc. What does that all look like? That typically runs between 1 and 30 days, depending on the size of the organization. Then we move on to day 31, and we start to monitor the suppliers that we've identified. We have identified the key suppliers. We've rated them as tier 1. We've identified the maybe not so critical ones, but important ones, and we've rated them as tier 2, etc. Maybe we're not monitoring all of them because they're not all important as far as the organization is concerned. So we stand up the monitoring piece, and it starts to collect information on all of those companies to prioritize which ones are showing the potential for business impact for the organization. And all of this information is automatically collected and fed back to various different reports and dashboards, etc. Then we move on to sort of operationalizing and collecting evidence and putting in place the workflows. Now, the stand-up monitoring piece is really, it's very important because at that stage we're able to, we've identified all the suppliers, we're able to report back to you and say, these are all your suppliers, this is the current inherent risk of these particular suppliers. And then you can start to work on remediation. And that's important to get that inherent risk established as early as possible. And that's typically why we do it as a second step. But then once you understand inherent risk of those suppliers, then you start to operationalize the program a bit more, make sure you've got the right workflows in place, make sure you've got SLAs around this with the different suppliers. And this will involve working with, the legal team potentially, or maybe if you're outsourced lawyers, etc., working with contractors, working with your suppliers, etc., to maybe define some of these contract requirements and make sure you have strong SLAs in place. And then, of course, the regulatory reporting, make sure you have the ability very easily, very quickly at a click of a button to report to the regulator and produce that report, rather than have to spend, maybe days or weeks building those reports. And also that applies to your board reports. If you are required to report to the board in some way on a regular basis, is that process manual today? How does it work today? With something like Risk Exchange in place, this process becomes very, very straightforward. You're able to go in and run a report very quickly and then use that to build out your board report and feedback to the board. Because of course, going back to what I said earlier, the board needs to understand this information. They do have a legal requirement, and they are personally liable if there is any issues that haven't been covered as far as the regulation is concerned. So I'm not going to go through these because we're running a little bit on time, but discovery piece, we've sort of talked about this: consolidate the inventory, tier the suppliers, and we'll start to run the external scans and establish the baselines and inherent risk. Then we switch to, on the continuous monitoring, we start to prioritize what suppliers are important, etc. We'll define alerts with the owners, the business owners, not just the security team. It's really important to define this with the business owners themselves. And typically we'll run a pilot initially where we're establishing the program across maybe 50 suppliers, or maybe if you only have a small supply chain, it might be 5 or 10 suppliers to establish the program itself and make sure it's working before we scale it up to the whole supply chain. And then operationalize that, of course, make sure it's embedded, TPRM is embedded into the business. This is critically important. This is not an IT function or a cybersecurity function that sits outside of the business. This needs to be embedded fully into the existing business, into the existing risk management program. Otherwise, it's just not effective. And of course, then you're able to map, your compliance against the NIS2 or DORA or NIS in the UK or PRA requirements, etc. And then start to do your quarterly board reporting, as I already touched on. So 5 questions to ask yourself, your team really, or ask yourself on this call. How many of our critical suppliers were assessed within the last 90 days? Maybe if you want to pop that in the chat, that would be great. We won't disclose which company it is. We only see the information, so we won't obviously pass that on. But it'd be good to know, typically how many suppliers have you assessed in the last 90 days? If these are tier 1 suppliers, if a tier 1 supplier was breached today, how would you actually know that happened? Would you hear from the supplier themselves? It's not that common, unfortunately, because they want to hide that or fix it before they have to report on it. Would you hear from it, through maybe news media or something like that? Obviously, that's a big problem. You definitely don't want to hear it from Sky News or something like that. So again, how quickly would you know that? Do you have any mechanism in place to track this? Can you produce a current register of all of your suppliers for your auditors this afternoon? So if your auditor walked in and said, show me a list of all your suppliers, can you provide that list? This is really, really, really key. And this is where a lot of companies fall down. They're just not able to come up with this number. And we have seen many, many, many occasions where companies take many, many weeks to identify who those suppliers are. And also one of the bigger problems with larger organizations is that they can maybe identify a list of companies, but they have no idea who the contact is, who they're dealing with in that company, who's the owner from the business point of view, who's what we call the business owner, right? So that's also important. It's not just a case of getting the list of suppliers. It's important to be able to identify who owns that business relationship, who should we contact, who's responsible for contacting us. All of these things need to be documented in a contract and some form of operations manual, effectively. And then which obligations are you required to be compliant with? Can you evidence that today? If you're required to be compliant with DORA, are you able to evidence that today if someone asks you? Because I can guarantee you, if you have a breach and you're in financial services, the regulator will be asking you to evidence these things. So you need to be in a position to be able to do that. And who's responsible in your organization for vendor risk management? Is it a particular person? Is it a particular team, etc.? And there has to be some form of risk reduction program in place. It's not a case of reporting the news and doing nothing about it. It's extremely important that when you do discover something, or you run that regular report, or the regular monitoring turns up something, that there is a way to reduce that risk effectively through remediation. Is there an SLA in place that says that the supplier must act and address any critical security vulnerabilities? This is not very common in contracts. We don't see it very, very often. Some of the better companies have this in place. They have ways to contractually, enforce that particular type of requirement onto the supplier themselves. But it's almost a starting point. Even before you build that program, it's important to have contracts that enable you as an organization to enforce these requirements on this SLA effectively onto the suppliers themselves. So, sorry, I've run slightly over there. We were planning to do about 30 minutes, but hopefully everyone found that interesting, informative. As I said at the beginning, it wasn't going to be a product pitch. Hopefully it didn't come across that way. Hopefully it was interesting and there's something to take away. And we're very, very happy to come and talk to any company individually in a closed workshop and get into some of the details under NDA, etc., and go into some of these things in a lot more detail. But for now, I'll hand it back to Serena is on the call here to see if there's any questions that we need to cover. Okay, here we go. Great. So where do most organizations underestimate the complexity when they first try to map out the fourth party dependencies? So a lot of organizations, when it comes to this, they completely underestimate it because it is a complex requirement. And under GDPR, companies, processors are required to inform their customers if they're processing data, personal data for them, that these are their critical suppliers, etc. And they're required to do that once a year, right? But our experience of that, it just doesn't work, right? Suppliers change all the time. Companies are constantly bringing on new suppliers. So it's really a difficult task for someone to do. And really the cadence of that once per year is not really adequate, right? How does that really help you from a risk point of view? So you need some form of continuous monitoring, some form of continuous discovery in place that enables you to, at the click of a button, really, pull up all of the fourth parties that particular third party is using today. And Risk Exchange can certainly help with that. But as I said earlier, we have seen some companies try to do that with spreadsheets. You try to use public sources, companies' house information, shareholder information, all sorts of different pieces of information, and none of them are really successful. So it is a very complex thing to try and manage. So it's something we can go into a lot more detail if somebody wants to talk about that offline, but hopefully that helps. Any other questions? For organizations already using a vendor risk platform, what's the most common thing Risk Exchange surfaces that the existing tool was missing? So I think a lot of organizations, I guess it depends how you define what they currently have. So if you've got spreadsheets in place and that's what your program consists of, then of course Risk Exchange is going to surface a lot more information to you. It's going to be able to tell you, this company's had a security breach, this company's had a new security vulnerability. It's able to provide much more insight to the organization by going through our assessment process. It's able to provide fourth party information. There's many, many, many different things that the Risk Exchange will surface compared to having a spreadsheet. But if you're maybe so let's say you're using something like OneTrust, for example, which is just questionnaires, right? So again, OneTrust does not cover continuous monitoring. There's no way to continuously monitor a company. There's no way to identify fourth parties, for example, with a tool like OneTrust or Process Unity or some of those or GRC type tools. If you're on the other side, you're using some form of security ratings tool, then Risk Exchange can replace that or complement that depending on your requirements. So we can provide you with the ratings, the same ratings, but we also provide you with the assessment information, the compliance information that you are required to report to the regulator. Unfortunately, a rating on its own is not adequate for the regulator. The regulators will not take that rating as evidence of good risk management across your supply chain. It certainly forms part of it, but it's important to look at not only the outside of the organization, the outside in as we refer to it, but also the inside out and the broader program. And how do they run their current security program? What processes are in place? What certifications are in place? All of these things are required for the regulator. Hopefully that answers that. Any other questions? No. Okay. So just to finish off, we are going to be at Infant Security this year, and as I said on this display here, B114. We'd love to see you at the stand. We have some fantastic new product releases, which we can't really talk about on this, but all will become clear in the next couple of weeks, and we will be launching a brand new second generation platform at the show. So we'd love to see you there, even for a cup of coffee and a chat and we can demonstrate the platform to you and get into some of these details in a bit more sort of lower level detail. But, you know, in the meantime, if there's anything you want to ask us confidentially, just reach out to us. You can reach out to me personally or reach out to the team. You can go onto our website, get various pieces of information there. Of course, there's a lot of thought leadership pieces there you might find interesting as well, and sign up for a demonstration if you wish. Okay. Thank you so much for taking the time to join this webinar. Thank you.
Thank you. That's great. Again, as we said, please reach out and we will be following up with you. Thanks very much, and hopefully we'll see you at InfoSec.
Thanks, Susan.
Bye.
Bye-bye.